Okay, it's a little after 2, so I think we should get started. Sadie, is my microphone on or am I muted? It's on?
Yep, you're all
Okay,
set.
fantastic. Thank you so much. I wasn't sure. It was telling me I was muted part of the time. So I think we're ready to get started. Now, Jordan, I know you
Great.
wanted to introduce us a little bit, so I'm going to turn everything over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Camp. So for those of you who might not know me, I suspect there's probably not many of you on this call, but I am Jordan Felby with the Detroit Regional Workforce Fund at the United Way for Southeastern Michigan. This is a training that we are offering through the Returning Citizens Learning Community, which is a learning community, kind of a community of practice around discovering best practices to serve the justice involved and justice impacted populations, which is really, really timely right now as we're having a lot of conversations around equity. And this is a population that often gets kind of forgotten in a lot of those conversations. This is a direct result of the research report that we commissioned and published last year. I believe we have Dr. Paul Draus on the phone, who was one of the key researchers on that project. And this was kind of generated through that research to really help practitioners understand trauma-informed care. Let me introduce my colleague, Lori Kopak, who has been helping to put this together. Lori, if you want to say hi.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
So Lori has been working really, really hard to pull all of this together and to help find our fantastic trainer, Dr. Jessica Camp. So I'll let you introduce yourself.
Oh, thank you so much. So I just want to introduce you to the training team so that you know who we are and we seem familiar as we kind of move into future trainings and learning opportunities. So my name is Jess Camp. I'm a former professor of social work with a history of working in the CMH system as an adult mental health and substance use therapist in Wayne County. When I'm not providing healing-centered restorative engagement training, I actually work as an external program evaluator because I'm a bit of a data enthusiast. And I love using research as a tool to create social justice change. Sadie Shattuck is also joining us today. She's a master's level student at the University of Michigan School of Social Work and is currently interning at the Office of Metropolitan Impact, which is the Center of Community Engagement at U of M Dearborn. She frequently uses her community organizing technology skills, and she uses them together to help support education, advocacy, and research, and has graciously joined me today in order to help with navigating Zoom. So if you need any help, she's here to help us. Lastly, we have our guest of honor, who is a re-entered citizen himself, an expert in criminal justice and a well-known advocate for reform. He is a professor in the criminal justice program at U of M Dearborn, community leader, father, and an all but dissertation doctoral student. He's the executive director of the nonprofit Youth Justice Fund, and he works with individuals who were incarcerated as youth to help them understand and recover from the impact of trauma before, during, and after incarceration. He was recently featured on the front page of the Detroit Free Press for this work, so he might look somewhat familiar to you. He'll be sharing his personal story today, what led him to incarceration, and what was helpful for him not only to return from incarceration, but to become a leader for justice reform. So now that I've had a little bit of an opportunity to share a bit about us, I'd like to get a better idea about who you are and what brings you here today and what you might be interested in. The poll will appear on your screen. Please select as many of the options as apply to you by clicking and then submitting the poll. And Sadie, thank you. It looks like you've shared our first poll. And I see those numbers continuing to come in. And just to share the results with you. So hopefully, Sadie, are those showing on the screen?
They are, yep.
Thank you so much. So we can
Mhm.
see that the majority of what draws people here today, not surprisingly, is that you work with returning citizens. But we can see that we also have people who've come here because they have family members or loved ones who are currently incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. They work in leadership of organizations that serve returning citizens and frontline workers who are doing that wonderful work. And are interested in expanding their use of trauma-informed care. So fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. So there's going to be a number of ways that I'm going to be here to help support your learning over the fall. First, there's today's training, which will be the first in a series of 3 trainings that will be offered. In short, today will be an introduction. The late September training will discuss how trauma impacts organizations and systems level responses that we can engage in. And October's training will discuss self, one-on-one and group practices that will facilitate healing for returning citizens and other trauma-exposed populations. In addition to this, I'll also be offering 8 smaller group sessions limited to about 20 to 25 participants. This will help us provide in-depth learning experiences, one-on-one discussion, and networking opportunities. So I'm really interested in you letting me know what you might be most interested in seeing in those sessions. So in the email that went out today, there was also a link to a survey. Now, Sadie can open the chat function and also share that link at this time, so you can open that up and set it aside. It will ask you about a number of topics that you might be interested in me covering, whether it's assessment and evaluation, whether it's bringing community leaders in who are doing this work to talk about experiences that they've had. So please take an opportunity to fill that survey out for me, and I will craft those 8 smaller sessions on the basis of those results. Lastly, I developed an educational website to help support our trainings this fall. I know that during this global pandemic and working from home, if you are able, and probably more so if you're not, that there's a number of factors that may interfere with being able to be fully present, whether you're caring for others, the stress of worrying about being sick, or maybe having a loved one who is sick can be stress added. To help with this, I'm going to provide a recorded copy of each of these trainings that will be accessible for the whole next year, and these will post about 24 hours after we do the actual training. I've provided additional reading material, helpful websites, professional news and blog resources, and even community resources on this site. Additionally, United Way has purchased 2 books that they will be sending to RCLC members who are active in these fall trainings. And by active, they'd like to see attendance at 2 trainings in order to receive those books. We will be documenting attendance for each of the trainings, including the small group sessions, so that we can make sure to turn the information in, so that if you're interested in those 2 textbooks, the first one, which will be The Body Keeps Score by Bessel van der Kolk, and the second one, which will be The Little Book of Restorative Justice by Howard Zehr. So if you're interested in that, please continue to stay in contact with me. For this website, if there are things that you're interested in me posting or resources you'd like me to share, please email me at jkcamp@socialworkdata.com at any time and let me know what you'd like to see there. This website will continue to grow over the course of this fall as I learn what's more interesting and what's more helpful to you. Since the website can only be accessed by Google, it's designed specifically for you guys, so you can't just type it into Google and find it. I'd like Sadie to send the link out now in the chat function via Zoom so that you have that information available to you. It also went out and was the final link on the email, hopefully inviting you to today's training. And so I'm going to give her a second to copy and paste and send that out to you so that you have it. Click on that and you can see there will be a variety of resources, including today's training slides, available for you if you'd like them. Michael DeVoe published in the Harvard Civil Rights Liberties Law Review about his experience being incarcerated for 32 years. The title of his article was "The Trauma of Incarceration Experience." He was witness to murders, violence, and deprivation as punishment. He has this to say: I had previously been considered in transit, but finally at Sing Sing, I received my prison number, and the process of institutionalization began. Getting my number was a memorable event. The number was how I would be identified from that day forward. It was a number that was shouted over the PA system when I was being summoned. If the mail was sent to me but did not include my number, it was returned. I no longer existed. I no longer had a name worth remembering. I had become inmate 79A2747. This numbering was a part of the process to strip me of my humanity, my dignity, and my self-respect. And it was hard getting used to being identified that way. I began my journey as Mr. DeVoe, and I wanted to remain him. I resisted becoming inmate 79A2747. I was told that I did not think of myself as being an inmate because I was not humble enough, although I was respectful and polite. I was assaulted so that I could be made into an inmate. Every encounter with people from the outside world, whether visitors or other guests, was followed by acts of humiliation, which included being stripped naked and being made to expose every body cavity, running fingers through my hair and showing the bottoms of my feet. Unlike the process of institutionalization, when I came from prison, there was no corresponding process to prepare me for the time that I would be released. Having been released, I still know of no process designed to repair the damage done. I know of no debriefing. I know of no stand-down procedure. All that was provided and all that is currently provided was goodbye, get out. Those fortunate enough to leave as I have been must discover how to rebuild their lives on their own. Since this publication in 2013, there's been an increase in reentry services and pathways that we now work in to undo institutionalization and rehumanize. But how nice would it be if we thought of the incarceration process in a way that allowed us to start the process of reentry from the very first moment of incarceration? In the trainings that we will provide for you this fall, we'll develop tools that will help you build programs, workflow processes, and systems that restore identity, relationship, and belonging for individuals who have experienced incarceration. Today, I'm going to focus specifically on the consequences of traumatic stress and traumatic exposure, on development, behaviors, and life pathways. There will be parts of this webinar that may feel very negative or overwhelming at times, and may even bring up concerns or fears for loved ones who are survivors, or yourself if you are a survivor. Throughout my presentation, I want you to remember 3 things. Recovery from trauma is possible, and when we increase our knowledge and our impact of trauma on us and our clients, and we work to create healing, is probable. Having personal experiences with trauma does not mean that you will have all or any of the outcomes or adverse consequences that I discuss. I'm sharing what we know from best practices, research, and science on what can happen, not what will happen. Trauma is common, and if you're working with individuals who've experienced trauma, you're likely experiencing trauma in some fashion, even if it's secondary. You may be having some personal experiences of trauma triggered right now with the coronavirus or managing toxic stress. I think that there's a lot of us who are drawn to human service fields because we know from personal experience how much change is needed. This can be hard because sometimes we find ourselves in difficult moments managing our personal responses to trauma while we serve others. In future trainings, we will continue to work on building sets of techniques that help us recognize trauma in ourselves and others and work towards healing. So as a recap, if you feel overwhelmed at any point, please remember, recovery is probable. The impact of trauma is complex and is experienced individually. So although we scientists can say what can happen, we don't know what will happen for everyone. And we are likely all managing some level of toxic stress right now during the global pandemic. You are not alone in your experiences. So let's dive in. Whether from your work with returning citizens or your personal experiences, I'm sure you've heard a bit about trauma-informed practices at this point, but I'm wondering how much personal experience or training you've had in this particular approach. I'd like us to do a poll now asking a bit about your level of expertise in trauma-informed care, also referred to as healing-centered engagement, which is what we'll be calling it from these trainings moving forward. Please click on the response that best corresponds to your level of expertise. As those results continue to come in, if you're a beginner to this topic, welcome. I believe a lot of this information may help you think about your work with returning citizens and even how you may be impacted by the needs and the stories of those that you serve. If you're more advanced or an expert, thank you for joining us today. Although some of this information may not be new to you, I hope that the discussion today will help facilitate ongoing conversations about work with returning citizens and creating overall systems change that improves pathways to recovery, opportunity, and well-being. Let's share those poll numbers now. Sadie, I got an error on that. Are those poll numbers shared?
Yeah, sorry, I think I shared them before you did. So
oh, no, that's okay. So we can see that there's some folks that have no experience or beginning experience, and folks who have a little bit more experience than that. So it seems like the majority of individuals have been introduced to this topic, but maybe you're still honing your expertise. So we'll continue to work together on that this fall. Thank you. There's a cyclical relationship between trauma or toxic exposure and disconnection from well-being and opportunity. Trauma has been shown to contribute to dropout from school, challenges in connecting with peers, health issues, and difficulty getting and keeping a job, just to mention a few of the adverse impacts we know about. Alternatively, being disconnected from opportunity and not having access to good jobs, family-sustaining wages, inadequate healthcare or mental health care, living in an under-resourced community, experiencing racism, sexism, transphobia, Islamophobia, or deprivation like hunger can all be factors that contribute to the development of toxic stress and then increase chances of having a traumatic experience. This is where we see that trauma is much larger than a simple individual experience or traumatic event, but is deeply couched in other social issues and illnesses. We call something like this a wicked problem, and trauma is definitely a wicked problem. We identify wicked problems by the way that they are complex and intertangled with other social issues. Wicked problems can always be described as a consequence or symptom of another problem. There's no easy or clear solution, and sometimes as we try to provide solutions and we try to solve them, we actually can make the problem worse. So what do I mean by that? Let me give an example. One example might be the idea of deinstitutionalization, where individuals with mental health disorders were previously held in asylums, and in the 1950s and early 1960s, we de-incarcerated. We rapidly moved individuals from that incarceration as treatment to community. Now, community-based mental health programs are strong, evidence-based, and really the appropriate path to provide care. But without receiving adequate resources and support, many individuals with mental illness from that point on have struggled with homelessness and increased contact with the criminal justice system. In fact, jail continues to be one of the largest, if not the largest, mental health provider in the US. This is an example where a solution actually made the problem worse, a sign of a wicked problem. Traumatic exposure is deeply intersected with incarceration through systems of racism, poverty, and social beliefs, traditions, and policies. Trauma can lead someone to incarceration through bad decisions or behaviors that one uses to manage the feelings of trauma, such as drug use. It can lead somebody to incarceration because of how an individual re-experiencing trauma might be perceived by others. If I was having a traumatic experience in public, I might get a very different reaction from the police than if I was a person of color or if I were a man. So these are things we need to be cognizant of. Furthermore, our justice system creates trauma. It fails to recognize how trauma may lead someone to becoming charged. It's slow to change policies that have over-policed poor neighborhoods of color, and incarceration itself, which is described by most as a type of regimented hellscape of abuse, neglect, and strictly reinforced racial tribalism. It's a time to be survived, not generally a time to thrive. Still, there are new changes that are moving individuals from incarceration to thrive, such as the extension of second chance Pell Grants, the expansion of problem-solving courts, increased funding for reentry services and treatment are all a start. But we are a long way off from the criminal justice system becoming a space for rehabilitation rather than one for punishment and retribution. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, provides guidance for trauma-informed programs, and they say that our very first step is to realize the widespread impact of trauma and the potential pathways for recovery. So I think that this is a good place to start our conversation today, and I'd like to do that by defining terms that I've already been using so far in this lecture. First is stress. Now, stress can be positive and healthy. It can be motivating. It can be that factor that helps push us to apply for that job that we're just not sure that we'll get, but we want. It can help us get our work done in a timely manner, and it can help us sometimes try those new experiences or things that we're a little bit uncertain about, but we want to do. Positive stress can motivate us. If we add slightly more stress than that, we get to tolerable stress. This is a type of stress that can still cause a temporary disruption in our lives, but can be caused by good or bad events. If we're worrying about a loved one who is ill, but who will recover, non-complex types of grief and loss, major life transitions like graduating and trying to find that first job, getting married, or having a child. So these can all be examples of tolerable stress. Tolerable stress is stress that can cause this disruption, but usually that life disruption eases readily once the event causing the stress resolves. Adding a little bit more stress, we're now talking about toxic or traumatic stress. This is stress that is strong, frequent, ongoing, unhealthy stress that is tremendously disruptive. Hunger and not having access to enough food regularly. High levels of neighborhood violence and fearing for your safety when you leave your home. Bullying, complex grief, loss of a close loved one or a primary support, especially in childhood, can all cause this type of stress. Trauma, on the other hand, is very similar to toxic stress, but there are different kinds and amounts, and trauma does not necessarily need to be experienced directly. Both organizational trauma or an agency's reaction to working in high stress, low resource environments, and secondary trauma, a personal reaction to hearing about traumatic experiences of others, are indirect consequences of trauma. They can be just as harmful, just as disruptive, and cause prolonged issues and impact on somebody's life. From here, there are direct experiences of trauma, which include acute trauma. This used to be called type 1 trauma, and refers to a single intense traumatic experience, a single experience of abuse, one time, a car accident, an accidental injury, being robbed at gunpoint, surviving a scary weather event like a devastating hurricane, or being close to a wildfire that threatens but doesn't consume your home are all examples of incidents that could account as acute trauma. When somebody has more prolonged experiences with trauma, but not multiple types of trauma, like ongoing emotional or physical abuse, consistently not having parents sober enough to provide proper care and supervision, or displacement from one's home caused by a natural or man-made disaster, this can be considered chronic trauma. This used to be called type 2 trauma as well. Lastly, and this is a newer definition of trauma, it's when both acute and chronic trauma happen at the same time throughout the course of someone's life. This is called complex trauma or developmental trauma. If someone has repeatedly been exposed to abuse, neglect, racism, violence, deprivation, Interspersed with the death or loss of loved ones, accidents, injuries, and illnesses, they have experienced complex trauma. When I worked as a therapist in the CMH system in Wayne County, this was often the type of trauma survivor I would be counseling. I'm predicting that the clients that you serve who've been formerly incarcerated are likely to be experiencing complex trauma as well. Although depending on if they've had access to any recovery services, they may not be formally diagnosed and they may not be aware of the fact that they have trauma. This will be the type of trauma most likely to cause interference when you're doing work, whether it's employment support services, counseling, education support, housing, medical care, really any human service at all. In the slide, as we go down the list here, I'm hoping that you can see that as we're adding more severity and quantity of stress. The more stress that there is, the more likely it will cause trauma and other problems. Now, I want to be pretty clear about this. Experiencing a toxic stress or traumatic event does not mean that you will develop trauma or ongoing experiences due to it. We all have resiliency factors, strengths, protective factors that can help us when we experience an extremely stressful or traumatic event. A single loved one, a concerned teacher, a mentor, or a friend. If we have a strong sense of personal self, a will to persevere, and a desire to help others, we can grow our resiliencies and our strengths at any time, at all times, and we can grow after a traumatic event has occurred. We actually call this growth post-traumatic growth, and it can help us when new hardships and stress arise. Although today's training is going to focus mostly on introducing you to the concept of trauma, the following trainings are solely dedicated to the personal, professional, and organizational approaches that move people towards healing, building resiliency, and personal growth. So, what behaviors or symptoms might you recognize in someone that you're working with who's experiencing trauma? Individuals who are struggling with trauma-related symptoms can engage in a set of common behaviors. These can be difficult to work with since they're not responding to the services you're providing, they're actually responding to the trauma. Individuals actively experiencing trauma may have difficulty with emotional reaction or regulation, and may have emotional responses that don't always seem to match the situation. A minor frustration may cause a very large anger response. Alternatively, someone may feel very difficult to engage. They're not fully in the room with you when you're working with them. Or they get that job opportunity that they've been trying for, and despite describing being happy, they just don't seem that excited from their body language or their facial expressions. Individuals who are struggling with trauma often cycle between moments of high arousal and attentiveness, looking for places that danger might potentially come from. And after an extended arousal period, they may crash as the brain and body can't maintain that level of attentiveness for long. They may have difficulty sitting with you, relaxing, concentrating to work on setting or achieving goals. They might have difficulty making decisions or choices, future planning, or following through with goals, even when it seems like to you that things should be pretty clear or pretty easy. Clients might even demonstrate difficulty with good stress. Sometimes this can even be more difficult than events that cause bad stress. This can be because at the time they might be worried deep down that they're not good enough or have the skills or ability to keep that job or earn that educational opportunity or other positive things that have just happened for them. Look for stress reactions during good times as well as bad, and don't be afraid to talk about these. When you've had a lot of bad happen to you, it can feel like the good things are scary because sometimes it's something that you could lose or have taken away from you. Clients experiencing trauma may try and numb emotions with drugs and drinking. They might avoid places and situations or people that trigger feelings or emotions that remind them of the trauma. This can be especially difficult because providing support and help can feel threatening to someone who may have had very few healthy relationships in their life. Expect your clients to struggle with showing up at the start of their recovery or reentry. Make sure to block time when taking on new reentering citizens to plan on reaching out and re-engaging. Having people in your life when you're used to people hurting you can be hard, so be patient. Now let's have a quick check-in. Knowing a bit more about how trauma might present, have you noticed any behaviors or actions among your clients, employees, students, or other groups that you work to serve? Maybe it's something new you've noticed in the stressful changes brought on by the coronavirus pandemic. Without mentioning any potentially identifying specifics, share with us in a few words some of the things that you've noticed. You can do this by going down to the bottom of your screen. You should see a little thought bubble or cartoon chat bubble. It will say chat underneath it. If you click and open that up, you'll be able to type and share your thoughts with us at this time. Low-hanging fruit might be clients showing up late or scheduling with you all of the time and then not showing at all.
Hi, Dr. Camp, just checking. You just want people to put it in the group chat, right?
Yes, please.
Okay, great.
Yeah, Karen, thank you. Yes, avoidance is one of the major, I'm going to talk about this in just a second, but there's 4 kind of major groups of symptoms that therapists like myself look for, and avoidance is one of them. So it actually can be a sign that things are going well if somebody actually starts no showing you. And one of the things that I do just right up the front, the first day that I'm planning with somebody, is I actually begin to talk to them a little bit about, hey, there might become some times that we talk about some difficult things and you're gonna wanna ditch me because those things feel hard. Please don't. That's actually a sign that we're beginning to dig in and really do some good work. And so I try to identify that right up front. Yeah, Erin, thank you. So you've noticed a lot of these symptoms or behaviors too. Yep, very common. Rosa, thank you. Yeah, loss of hope, also feelings of shame or despair, not attending healing circles, and don't want to share difficulties. Of course, because sometimes sharing those difficulties can really make us feel vulnerable. Attachment and boundary issues, yes, absolutely. Hypervigilance. Thank you, Carly. Emotional regulation patterns and anxiety is high. Yep, very, very common. Attachment issues, you can sometimes find that clients will oscillate between being overly attached with you and very unattached. And so sometimes you'll notice that they'll want to come in and see you all of the time and be with you all of the time because you're beginning to be like a really healthy influence or a healthy mentor for them. And so they want to be exposed to that as much as possible. And so you can feel a little drained because there can sometimes be some clinginess. And there also can be kind of almost the opposite of that, flat affect. No matter how hard you're working, no matter how hard you're doing those motivational interviewing skills, right? Making sure that, you know, your client's goals are the goals for the session. You know, sometimes like it just doesn't matter, like you're almost unable to emotionally engage because there's such a wall up. That person has built like such a protective barrier around them that sometimes building that relationship can be really tough. Clients dropping out of a training program right before completion because although they had a bad drug screen with their agent, was shared with the school and they might be dismissed. So yep, right, so they self-exclude. Absolutely, that is something that we notice. So instead of necessarily having the opportunity to have those conversations when those difficult things have happened, clients might fear feeling shame or might fear that you're going to tell them that they don't belong. When you have felt so on the outside of everything, getting that message that you might not belong in something that was actually helping you can be heartbreaking, and we have to be extremely sensitive still holding people accountable for their actions and you know, trying to figure out why the substance use is happening, but while also telling somebody that just because their behavior is unacceptable, that they are not unacceptable. Our behaviors do not have to be who we are. And that is an antithesis of the justice system. If you murder somebody, you are a murderer. But sometimes these labels try to predict what people are going to do in the future. And that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what they'll do in the future. I've had a lot of clients who have done some very terrible things because they've been put in very terrible situations, and there was no good choice. And now they believe that they'll never be accepted, they'll never belong, they'll never be able to have an opportunity back to belonging. And that's the first thing that we need to challenge. We need to make sure that the spaces that we're creating, especially for returning citizens, are spaces that they belong. The behavior can be bad. People aren't bad. I've seen some of these behaviors and symptoms, especially interpersonal numbing among service providers who provide direct services. I can't imagine the trauma which they are exposed to through their work. Absolutely. We're going to be talking more about secondary exposure to trauma. This is something that we are faced with, that we're exposed to in the work that we do. And sometimes our own responses to trauma can actually cause us to be kind of bad at our work because we just try to build what is normal psychological barriers to deal with the stress of sometimes experiences that we have with our clients or the stories that we hear. Having spaces when we're working with each other that are also restorative and healing together, that we're taking time to connect as a healing community, is incredibly important. We have to start with us. We can't model behaviors that if we're not living in an environment where those behaviors can thrive. So we have to start with our agencies. We have to start at home. Then we can give others, right? We can't give other people what we don't have for ourselves. So absolutely. Thank you so much for identifying that. Well, thank you so much for all of those thoughtful contributions.
Pardon me, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. David,
this is David.
hello.
I tried to chat you and I wasn't able to chat. I don't know why. I typed it in, but I don't see how to send, and I have no way to contact anybody to ask how to fix it because I can't chat. Is there something? I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I don't have to talk in the class. But,
you just hit enter. There's no send button.
Hit enter.
Mm-hmm.
It should go right through.
Okay, enter. Well, brilliant.
Yep,
I failed the minimum intelligence test.
Oh, not
no
you
worries.
are fine. It looks like it sent to me privately, so I'll forward it out to everyone here.
Thank you, Sadie.
Yep, hold on. That resent.
I sent it to you because I thought I gave up on the all, but now I know how to do it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sadie, are you forwarding David? I'm still not seeing. There we are.
I am, sorry. It was having me retype it instead of copy and paste. So
no problem.
There it is.
Self-sabotage, a way to prove that one is unworthy. I've seen a lot of that. Okay, yes, I can't seem to send it at all. Thank you, David. Yeah, absolutely. I really kind of wanted to highlight the idea that sometimes when good things happen, that's actually a time of really high stress for trauma survivors in general, but also returning citizens. And I have seen a lot of self-sabotage. Somebody who has maintained sobriety for a long time or is actually doing a really excellent job in working and unpacking some of their trauma experiences can absolutely, like the second that they get that job or that educational opportunity that they've been striving for, it feels overwhelming and it feels, I think, scary sometimes to have that thing that could be taken away. And that's when I'm able to kind of dig a little bit deeper with clients on why they've self-sabotaged and why they feel unworthy. That tends to be the story that comes out, is both having something that could be taken taken away and it be meaningful, and the vulnerability that a good thing can cause, but also a true and deep-seated feeling of unworthiness. We have to work on those things concurrently. And I find that by, creating true communities of relationship and belonging, we can have those difficult conversations. And so then we can actually begin to break down and understand why sometimes a client would use substances right before having a major event. Life transitions can also be really difficult. So extra support services, both on the mental health and substance use side, can be really critical during those times. And breaking down with your clients, like, what might trigger those types of events too, and being cognizant of higher stress moments. When you've had a lot of stress, sometimes just a drop more, even if it's good, can sometimes, push things one way or the other. So I'm sure that you've seen a lot of that in your work. So I wanted to talk a little bit more here. What's key to know is that any event that triggers a survival response can potentially cause trauma. So I want to share a personal story. This is a pretty lighthearted story, but it, I think, highlights how trauma can be created from many events, even if they seem not serious. So I was sitting on a couch with a friend of mine. We were both working as camp counselors at a camp in beautiful northern Michigan. It actually was the very first job I ever had. So I, as kids do, I'm kind of picking at the couch a little bit, and a feather came out of one of the couch pillows, and I blew it at her and I said, "Angel feathers." She fell on the floor in terror and in tears. And I was horrified. I didn't know what I had done. As a child, she had crawled into her parents' hen house, and the hens swooped at her and scratched her and terrified her. And her dad realized pretty quickly and pulled her out. She was fine physically and unharmed, but from that day forward, a bird or feathers, especially thrown in her face, re-triggered the fear that she had as a baby in that hen house. She recovered quickly, but she has a specific phobia to feathers that remains even till today. So there can be a wide range of cultural, social, and personal differences with traumatic experience. Obviously, my friend is fine, and her trauma causes her very little distress day to day, just as long as a well-meaning friend doesn't try to blow feathers at her. Just because this is something that doesn't seem serious to us doesn't mean that it can't cause trauma. The only requirement is that a person's core survival instinct for themselves or somebody else kicked in when the event occurred. Trauma is frequently misdiagnosed as bipolar depression, attention deficit disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and intermittent explosive disorder, and I've only named a few. This is in part because currently the DSM, or Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is how we make diagnostic criteria in mental health, only allows for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And this does not always fit well with complex or developmental trauma in toxic stress disorders. We were hoping that complex post-traumatic stress disorder or developmental stress disorder would be added to the latest version of the DSM, but that didn't happen, unfortunately. And this means that you can't expect your clients, even ones who are getting the most top-notch mental health care, to necessarily come to you with a proper diagnosis. You're going to have to see beyond that label. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Trauma can also be extremely difficult to diagnose, even if you've got the training to be a therapist, as I do, because survivors may not remember that they've experienced a traumatic event. It legitimately looks like other types of diagnoses. You can see how having moments of high arousal and then a crash when you can't maintain that arousal might look a lot like bipolar depression, of having high moments, of having elated mood or being, very attentive, and then having that crash into depression. So it can legitimately look like other types of diagnoses. It can also cause other mental health symptoms. So there can be things co-occurring in addition to the trauma. And so sometimes those mental health symptoms are what get diagnosed. Despite this, a therapist like myself will look for 4 different classifications of symptoms to diagnose trauma. First, and what makes trauma unique from other mental health issues, is this idea of re-experiencing. This can be as real as a hallucination of the event occurring again. It can be a memory or a dream of the event, and it might actually just be a sense of danger or fear. Trauma can be re-triggered by a sight, sound, smell, touch, taste. Any way that we experience the world, we can re-trigger trauma. It might not be a tangible memory. Our brain doesn't work the same when we're fearful and afraid for our lives. Complete loss of the tangible memory is absolutely possible. When someone is triggered and re-experiences a traumatic event, it will feel like it's occurring right now, not as if they are remembering it from past. There might not be details, just a vague sense of fear. I once had a client who would feel like she had a heavy weight on her chest and that she couldn't breathe or move, and she just remembered flashes of light and darkness. Eventually, unfortunately, she remembered that she had been molested by a male adult relative who had been living in her home temporarily when she was a child, but for years she had just had a panic disorder diagnosis with asthma. She didn't understand that it would be triggered anytime that she would feel any weight on her chest whatsoever, even when it was her kids just jumping up to give her a hug. The survival part of our brain has no sense of time. It's designed to get us the heck out of danger and assess for similar future threats, like a warning or emergency system. It's not meant to do the heavy lifting on learning, memory, or cognition. The second set of symptoms that a therapist will look for is avoidance. When trauma occurs or is re-triggered, the overwhelming nature of the feelings and emotions the event causes will cause an individual to avoid places, people, things that could potentially be re-triggering. When someone doesn't know what may be a trigger for them, they might start avoiding everyone and everything to keep from feeling. They also might start using drugs and alcohol to help take that edge off. Drugs can activate reward centers in the brain that become diminished after long time exposure to trauma, and they help people feel better for a little bit. But obviously, street drugs are not medicine, so they quickly become a part of the problem and make things much, much worse. Because drugs and alcohol can help for a bit, it is key for trauma survivors who are using substances to engage in mental health and substance use recovery concurrently to help maintain sobriety. Third, as a therapist, I look for negative cognitions and moods. And this is a little bit what David was saying to us. When someone experiences trauma, especially complex trauma, it can impact their sense of self and feelings of control over the world around them. They may feel that bad things have happened to them because they are bad. They believe if they could have been stronger, smarter, faster, bigger, maybe they wouldn't have had these experiences or they could have stopped them from happening. They either experience a diminished sense of self to become invisible so they can no longer be harmed, or they attempt to become the biggest, baddest of all, so they are too tough and too scary to ever harm again. Re-experiencing trauma is scary, and like experiencing the trauma itself, it takes a lot of emotional and psychological energy to manage. If a survivor's trauma is triggered, they will be more likely to fight, flee, or avoid during this time. And it might appear that they have more cognitive difficulty, learning challenges, restlessness, or emotional outbursts during this time. While it is happening, they might hyperventilate, punch a wall, throw things, cry uncontrollably. They might have a completely flat affect and be impossible to engage, almost as if they've frozen right there in the chair in front of you. They might hide under furniture or curl up into the fetal position, or some combination of all of the above. During an arousal period, it is important to de-escalate and engage in a therapeutic breathing, manipulating tactile objects. I use silly putty. Sometimes we tear up paper. Focus on restoring calm at these times. If you have a client who knows that they're having difficulty with trauma, working on techniques like this before a trigger has occurred is far best. If they have a therapist, they likely have a few techniques that their therapist has taught them in their pocket that they can teach you to help you help them in moments that they're re-triggered. If you are interested in knowing some non-clinical techniques that you can use with adult clients, one-on-one, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about non-clinical techniques one-on-one to help clients manage triggers once they've occurred, let me know in the topical interest survey and I will get it on the calendar for a few weeks from today. So Sadie, did I hear someone try to jump in?
I think so, but I think it might have been a mistake. I looked through to see if anyone was, looked like they were trying to speak and it didn't look like it. So.
Okay. So what happens when we're exposed to trauma, and why are extremely high levels of stress bad for us? So we have two different parts of our neurosystem, responsible and stress responses, and they connect our brain and our body together. One helps us react to stress and danger, and the other brings everything back to normal when that danger is over. If you're around psychiatrists or neuroscientists, they're going to call the stress reaction part of our brain the sympathetic nervous system, or the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal gland axis, or HPA axis. This describes the specific brain structures involved in stress response.
Sorry, just a reminder to everyone to go on mute, please, if you are, answering the phone or anything like that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordan. And Sadie, too, if we see anyone jump up as speaking, we can manage that a little bit from here, too. Okay. So the HPA, or sympathetic nervous system. Therapists, we try to be a little bit more accessible. So we call it the fight, flight, freeze part of the brain, or the survival part of the brain. But whatever it's called, what it does is it provides the support services for all the higher order, heavy lifting, high energy consumer parts of our brain. But it also takes over in an emergency so that you will automatically do what you need to do to survive without stopping to think too much if an emergency has occurred. When activated, the survival brain will flood your system with adrenaline. Blood will rush from your organs to your muscles in less time than it takes you to blink. You don't need to be digesting if you need to fight or run. You'll likely pee or poop yourself. Don't worry about it. You just need to survive right now. It's not a problem. Your brain will redirect all of that energy for higher order brain function and decision making to your core automatic processing system. You don't need to philosophize or perform mathematics right now. You just need to run or make a strong fist or hold still enough that maybe the threat won't notice you and it will go away. What's problematic about increased exposure to trauma is that your brain is highly adaptive, and when it senses that a person is exposed to a lot of danger, it will beef up the survival part of the brain while reducing activity in the thrive part of your brain. Sometimes we say what fires together, wires together, and this means that your brain learns and builds connections from all the experiences, and if those experiences are mostly dangerous, then it will prepare for danger. Unfortunately, the emergency system is not intended to be on all the time, and it creates tremendous wear on the brain and body. Increased adrenaline and cortisol messes with the body's inflammation and immune responses. It makes people more susceptible to illness, autoimmune diseases, colds, asthma, even cancer and diabetes. The emergency system can't digest food. So stomach issues, cramps, bowel issues are extremely common. And because the survival brain isn't in charge of sleeping, insomnia can become a huge part of the problem. When consistently overactivated, the brain will draw away from developing wiring in the cortex. So speech, understanding language, feelings of connectedness, both emotionally and to one's body, ability to pay attention and learn, and ability to remember will all be impacted. The brain is in constant survive mode will first reduce activity in the most front and forward position of the brain called the frontal lobe. Our frontal lobe contains all of our higher order decision-making, emotional regulation, emotional recognition, emotional mirroring. Mirroring is when we see an emotion in somebody else, or we see that our dog is crying, and we feel sad too. We actually feel that emotion when we see it in somebody else, because the frontal lobe is also the root of our empathy skills. It's the first thing to go and the most difficult thing to gain back is kind of this idea of making complex choices, long-term planning, decision or life planning, setting goals and following through with those goals. This can be the part of the brain's activity that will actually be diminished. If we were to scan somebody's brain actively in trauma, we see that it does not actually physically work the same as somebody's brain who has not been exposed to trauma. So before we can reliably expect people to develop realistic, achievable life goals, we have to build the area of this brain up. And we can do that, just as one example, by sometimes offering small non-choice choices. An example of this might be, I'm glad you were able to join us for our session today. So did you want to start by looking for jobs or by looking for better housing? Now you have full intention on working on both of those things in that session, but by offering a choice, you're beginning to move that cognition back into the frontal lobe. And that's what we want to do. Move people from survive to thrive. Now, I know I've said a lot of things about the brain right now, and this might still feel a little distant and not as if something that you might actually use. So I want us to make little brain models right now that will give us the ability to talk about this, not only when we think about trauma exposure, but when we're talking about trauma exposure with others. So I am going to stop sharing for a minute and come back to our main screen. Okay, so this is how we make a brain model. If you'll show me your hand, now you don't have to necessarily do it at the screen, you can do it to yourself. I'm gonna show the camera so you can see what I'm doing. So first of all, start out with a real good map of Michigan. We Michiganders are really great at this. Then, as if you were showing me the number 4, tuck your thumb in a little bit on your hand. And lastly, take those fingers and just wrap them around the top of your thumb. If you look to the side, you'll see you have a little curlicue made by your thumb. This is the survival part of the brain. If you use a hat with your other hand and you touch all of the outside, not this part, all of the outside, that's your cortex. That's all of that higher order brain function part of your brain. So when we look at the brain, there's a few important structures that I want you to keep in mind. First of all, if you feel along your knuckles in the very front, that is the frontal lobe. It's right here in the brain. This is the part of our brain that does all that higher order decision making. It's considered the most advanced part of our brain. Our empathy, our emotional regulation, that's the part of the brain up here. If you feel a little bit further back until you get to your knuckles, your first 3 knuckles on your hand, this is your motor cortex. It allows you to move a lot if you're me. This allows you to move or dance or be athletic. It recognizes your body in space and in time. If you feel a little bit further out to your pinky, this is the temporal lobe. Over here, this is the part of your brain that either hears and understands speech, depending on which hemisphere we're at, or it gives us the ability to speak and communicate to others. All of that is over here. If you feel a little bit further back and you're just feeling the top of your hand, or right about here on your brain, this is the memory portion of our brain. We have all of our cognition, our short-term, our long-term memory, and we have a little chemical factory back there too that produces all of our neurotransmitters, or those chemicals that we need for our brain to work right. So that little factory's back there. If you feel back further, we have the occipital lobe, which recognizes visual information. And if you feel back all the way to your wrist, you're actually getting to about what we call the cerebellum. The cerebellum is the thing that's keeping you breathing, regulating your temperature, and doing all of those things that you don't have to think about in order to have happen. So the basic part of the brain. Now, I want to turn my hand to the side here. So I want you to see the survival part of the brain, which is your thumb. Now notice how your survival part of the brain is right in between both your brain stem, your cerebellum, which is all those automatic things your body does, and that higher order cortex, all of that advanced thinking. when you have a traumatic experience, this is the part of your brain that really beefs up. It's gonna shut down other parts of the brain on purpose because it doesn't want you philosophizing while you're trying to run away from a hungry bear. That's not the right time to do that. So because it's attempting to help you survive the best it can, it's gonna take over. It's gonna take over a lot of the automatic functions of your brain and your body. And that will all happen right here on the inside of your brain. Unfortunately, you can see after long periods of time, if that's the wiring that happens, all of that survival brain becomes really strong and beefy, and it takes over and it's aware. But it will do that at the detriment of other brain structures that we need to learn, to thrive, to pay attention, to do well in therapy. And so what we have to do is we literally physically move somebody from survive to thrive by thinking about healing and restoration. When we do brain scans and somebody has had an opportunity to engage in recovery, we can actually see that the same brain structures that were diminished before become replenished. So pretty cool, huh? Okay. I'm going to come back to our slide now. Okay, so I did warn you that I'm a former professor. So now we're going to have a pop quiz. Which of the following activities would a trauma survivor have the most difficulty with? Only select one. Okay, we've got about 55% of you who've responded. Don't be shy, I'm not giving out grades today. Next time though. All right, we have about 70% in, so I'm gonna end polling and I wanna share the result. So I'm glad that the majority of you answered difficulty with complex decision-making, long-term planning, goal setting, emotional mirroring, and empathy responses. Yes, correct. That is the number one thing. But for those of you who said any of the other responses, those are all things that trauma survivors do indeed have difficulty with. What we notice statistically, though, is this idea of planning, decision-making, emotional recognition, and regulation is the most problematic. But don't think that the other responses are wrong. They're not. They tend to not be as much of a problem. But really, anytime that survival part of that brain is activated, it will pull development from these parts of the brain. So you might be wondering, what happens to the survival part of our brain when it's activated for extremely long periods of time? So I want to introduce you to a new term. So far, you've heard me use the term toxic stress, and you've heard me use the term trauma exposure, and these are fairly the same. I want to introduce you to a new term called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. ACEs are generally referring to types of trauma, interpersonal trauma, or household trauma that we experience before the age of 18. The largest amount of research that we have on the impact of trauma exposure on individuals is the CDC ACEs study, which has tracked trauma exposure across the nation since about 1955. What we know from this study is that ACEs are associated with an increased chance of accidental injuries, mood disorders like depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, including suicidal ideation. ACEs are associated with, now note that I am not saying caused, We know there's never been a longitudinal or a causal study done with trauma exposure or ACEs. So I'm saying that they're associated because we know that these things work together, but we actually have not statistically done what we need to do to show that the chicken comes before the egg, if you will. So I'm going to say associated. We know that ACEs are associated with pregnancy complications, sexually transmitted diseases. We know that individuals who've experienced at least 4 different types of trauma have actually 4 to 12 times the rate of struggling with alcoholism and substance abuse. ACEs even cause an interference with employment and income, with trauma survivors on average earning less in degrees and less in income when compared to individuals who've not experienced trauma at all. When we look at trauma across the life course, including trauma that occurs in our families, including trauma that happens to our ancestors or even before we were born, we can show a connection to trauma across the life course that can lead to cascading problems, which is one of the reasons why it's so important for us to recognize this and then respond to it. Trauma can lead to disconnection from well-being. Disconnection leads to more disconnection. Without systems and pathways to recovery, well-being, trauma exposure can impact development, health risk behaviors, social problems, and is even associated with an early death. When you're driving from the very poorest neighborhood on the east side of Detroit to wealthier neighborhoods like Grosse Pointe, the average lifespan increases by 7 years on average. Now, this statistic comes from Poverty Solutions at U of M and was collected prior to the coronavirus pandemic. What would those numbers look like today? What will the numbers be like in the future if we fail to build systems that recognize the emotional and psychological impact in addition to the physical impact of coronavirus? Research shows us that ACEs are very common. And so if you look at the picture of this chart here, you can see, right, 36% of people have no ACEs, one ACE is met at 26%. And if you add up those numbers, you can see that 64% of the general population have had at least one traumatic exposure. And in general, this is fairly consistent when we look across the nation, but we do know that women are slightly more likely to experience sexual abuse and emotional abuse, whereas men report being slightly more likely to experience physical abuse. The main household challenges that exist are substance use and parental separation or divorce. Now, as you'll see in just a second, ACEs do not track community or social level trauma, just individual and household, which means that it fails to show differences in trauma exposure by race. Also, the CDC does not break down ACEs exposure by race. Still, studies that do exist and have done this show that social factors like systemic racism and police violence obviously increase trauma in communities of color and in under-resourced communities too. So what can we do about trauma? SAMHSA states that once we realize, so the number one thing that we needed to do today, once we realize that trauma is occurring, we need to begin to implement a method to recognize it or assess it. This can be a formal assessment, although as a therapist, I'm going to recommend if you assess trauma, also please assess for strengths and resiliencies. Only assessing for trauma lets us know what the problem is without giving us any clues on where to start with the healing process. You can also assess informally. So you might just assess this while you're having discussions or working with somebody as you're providing those wraparound services or helping that individual get the job. The most common assessment, and this probably isn't too surprising since I just talked about ACEs being the most common research, the most common assessment is the ACEs survey. So we all have an ACEs score. You can calculate your own ACEs score by giving yourself a 1 for any set of questions or statements that describe something that happened to you when you were under the age of 18. Your score will be out of a 10. So for example, if one of these sets of things happened to you as a child, you would have an ACE score of 1 out of 10. For example, question 1, did a parent or other adult in the house often swear at you, insult you, put you down, humiliate you, or act in a way that made you feel afraid or that you might be physically hurt? If you answer yes to both of these questions, you still just have a 1. If you answer no to both of these questions, you have a 0. And if you answer 1 to just one of these two statements, you would calculate yourself as having a 1. Now, I know that ACEs are very personal, so I am not going to ask you to share your number. I just want you to know what it is, because it can sometimes give us an idea of the trauma that we might be lifting and dealing with as we're helping others. I will, however, ask that when you have concluded, you've read this and you've calculated your score, please type done in the Zoom chat box so I don't accidentally move on before you're ready. Please take an opportunity to read through these questions and assess your own ACE score now. All right, it's looking like most people have had an opportunity to read through those and calculate their own ACEs score. So as I mentioned before, this ACEs assessment has the most research when compared to any other measure, but it does lack on comprehensiveness. It will not assess for community trauma, trauma from chronic illness or injury, natural disasters, or trauma caused by systemic racism, trauma while experiencing a global pandemic. Still, it's the most widely used measure, so I wanted you to have an opportunity to calculate your own score, both so that you could understand a little bit about what this measure does and doesn't do, but also so that if you do decide to use it, it can be a space to have a shared conversation about how we sometimes measure trauma exposure. Just as a side note, if you're thinking of assessing trauma in programs or your agency, please also develop a plan of support for your clients. Trauma often triggers feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, despair, shame, and fears of lacking control or agency over one's life. Do you have a therapist that's working with you? Are you certified to provide some type of counseling services as a part of your job? If not, you may not want to formally assess trauma until you have these supports in place. Implementing an assessment without proper follow-up could send the message that the traumatic experiences of your clients don't matter or that you don't care. You may trigger some uncomfortable feelings in asking these questions, and then your clients may begin to engage in that avoidance set of symptomology that we look for in trauma exposure. And that means they're going to stop attending the services that they need with you. If you're interested, I can also use one of the small group sessions to talk more about non-clinical assessments of trauma exposure, strengths, and resiliencies. If this is something that's interesting to you, please, once again, let me know in that topical interest survey that I sent out. Now that we've recognized some of the trauma that we may have experienced, let's talk about trauma among individuals who've experienced incarceration. Literature shows us that the connection between trauma exposure and incarceration is relatively new, but it's begun to show an unquestionable connection between these two experiences. For individuals who've experienced 4 or more types of trauma, or ACEs, I can say that now because you understand from the ACE measure what that means, they're 4 more times likely to be arrested and 3 more times to be incarcerated than other individuals who have not experienced trauma. Over 90% of the individuals who are currently incarcerated are believed to have at least one traumatic experience. Now, I want you to remember back, I had said that 64% of the general public had one traumatic experience or more. As much as that is too high, obviously, this is saying something about individuals who experience incarceration. And lastly, when we look at individuals who are incarcerated, if they had that traumatic experience prior to their incarceration, they are 2.64 times more likely to have a lifetime history of post-traumatic stress disorder. So on top of being somebody who is incarcerated and already has a risk of being trauma exposed, individuals who are then incarcerated in the system have a 2.64 on top of whatever the additional trauma exposure they had had that led to their incarceration. So this is pretty concerning. When we look at men who are incarcerated, they report on having 8 different types of trauma. Now I want to break this down. That is not 8 different traumatic events. It's 8 types of trauma that may potentially have happened repeatedly over their life. When we look at this, the majority of them have experienced some type of physical abuse, but overall, when we look at every type of abuse and neglect, the rates are much higher than men who've not experienced incarceration. Women experience higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder as well. As a matter of fact, this is even more striking. Women who are incarcerated experience such greater rates of interpersonal violence and sexual violence in men that it is more common for a woman in prison to have experienced this than not. Incarcerated women have higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder when compared to their male incarcerated counterparts. And this study, which was done by Carlson and Zielinski in 2008, showed that 41.8% of the women in the study met the diagnostic criteria. Originally, this study was met with some criticism because that's about 9% higher than previous studies that have looked at trauma among incarcerated women. Their numbers were checked, and indeed what we believe to be the case is that we were under examining trauma in incarcerated women, and therefore our numbers were much lower. So they may even be much higher than this. Trauma is so common among women who are incarcerated, especially women of color in the prison system, that some call this the trauma to prison pipeline. Because an area without pathways to recovery or opportunity, the pathways to the justice system are many. Lastly, where trauma can lead individuals to become justice involved, the prison system itself creates trauma. The use of solitary confinement, sometimes called the shoe or the box, has been shown to have 3 times the chances of causing the development of post-traumatic stress disorder when compared to prisoners who are not held in solitary confinement. Other measures of how incarceration creates trauma are actually incredibly difficult to find because there is no standard reporting on the quality of life of prisoners. There is no measures of the impact of incarceration and prison culture on the mental health of prisoners. If that doesn't scare you, it should. We have still all heard the news stories and personal stories that have been shared with us about those who are returning from a landscape of fear and violence that they have survived in incarceration to return to community. So I know I've shared a lot of numbers and a lot of statistics and a lot of brain things here. I want to bring them all to life a little bit more by turning it over to Professor Aaron Kinsel, who is going to be sharing with us his personal journey from incarceration to recovery. Sadie, can we unmute Aaron?
Yeah, give me just a minute.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Aaron, you should be unmuted now.
Thanks, Sadie. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Yeah, we can hear you.
perfect.
So Jess, what do I have, about 20, 25 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. So welcome everybody. I'm honored to be here and talk about a lot of this. This has been really interesting for me, but also, to be very blunt, very depressing for me to kind of hear a lot of these things that not just that I've gone through in my life, but like thousands of the people that I've interacted with over the last 20 years who've been to carceral spaces or on probation or juvenile justice systems, you name it. It's just really interesting to find all the parallels in my life and those I work with. So um, what I think is really interesting to kind of like go back a little bit is prison is extremely traumatic, but like the pathway to prison, I think is an even more important factor that we don't really understand, and how trauma really is a criminogenic factor that I think drives a vast majority of crime, not just in the United States, but in the world in general. So like the ACEs study there, I mentioned on the chat, like I got a 9.5 out of 10. So I was never sexually assaulted, but my conception, my mother was raped during my conception. And when she was pregnant, just towards the end of her term, she was raped again. So like all that trauma and the stress and everything that my mama was going through as a young teenage girl, I was experiencing that in the womb. So when I was born into this world, I was born with trauma. So like I've literally, as a 41-year-old man now, I've spent probably 42 years if you count the time in the womb, just various layers of compounded trauma. So I think, and I'm not, I think, unique in that aspect. Everybody I've worked with, and this is anecdotal evidence, like Dr. Cam said, there's very little studies that talk about, if any, about the traumatic events that prisoners go through, or people that have been, offenders of crime or victims of crime, et cetera. But like all the people I've worked with, way more than one traumatic event. I mean, honestly, you can't count the number of traumatic events that people go through that are in the prison system, like that I've worked with, particularly those that commit acts of violence. I think that's a unique population that we don't talk about in justice reform, is that we often kind of put people that are nonviolent drug offenders on this pedestal, particularly like with marijuana legalization. Like, these are the people that are deserving and should be let out. But at the same time, if we ignore, particularly in the state of Michigan, like the violent offenses that happen, we're actually missing the mark, because like violence is cyclical. Okay, so like we pass that along to our communities, to our children, and it becomes this endless cycle of trauma that continues to perpetuate unless we actually intervene and try to like humanize people that have gone through some of these experiences and made mistakes too and gotten into the system. So as a kid, I grew up in the projects of Toledo, Ohio. So everything that I seen as a little boy, I was with predominantly community of African Americans, Latinos, Hispanics, and some poor white folks too. And what I seen was systems of oppression. To the best of my recollection, it's mostly stories that I heard really at the projects, because I know I was just a little boy. I don't remember too much of it, but I know as I do start to have memories as a little kid that in the home, all I witnessed was violence. I watched my mother get raped multiple times. I watched her beaten to a bloody pulp. I've been physically abused by different men that she's been with, and I actually had this real hate and anger towards people that were criminals per se, or people that had come home from the penitentiary on parole, because I'm seeing all this violence as a little child and I'm being subjected to it, and my mother's being subjected to it. And I never really deeply understand where that violence came from. And now as a grown man, as a professional, I can trace all that back to trauma. And that's really the root of all evil, in all honesty. I mean, there's some kind of aberrations, like someone like Ted Bundy or someone that has some real biological and mental problems, that are going on. Like he was probably traumatized too, but I think it's a little different than the average person. That's a whole other story. But like just the average individual child that ends up going to prison is just severely traumatized. And as children, we mimic behavior too. So that's another thing that's important to understand. So like here I am, a little kid. I think the earliest contact I had with law enforcement was the age of 5, when I was going around with my mother's boyfriend, who was what you could probably call a cat burglar. He would break into houses, and this guy is teaching me as a 5-year-old child to break into homes. And he's using me as a mechanism to kind of like push me up into windows, pop locks, and like run into the house and unlock doors for him, make it easier for him to rob people. So I learned that behavior, and then he gets locked up in prison. So that's another thing too. Like, even though he was kind of abusive, he was the breadwinner in our family. So now after he goes to prison, me and my mama, we become homeless. So even though he was a violent asshole, excuse my French, but like he was someone that was providing for us, at least to an extent, which is kind of a really weird situation too. So at the age of 5 now, he's in prison and I'm off as a little boy breaking into homes and apartments, from what I learned from this seasoned criminal, um, to provide for my mama. And then I get caught as a little boy, and I already at the age of 5 had a criminal sophistication like many other children. I seen that there's this very adverse relationship with law enforcement. I demonize law enforcement in my community because they're taking people away. They're taking predominantly men, but some women, mostly men, out of the homes, out of the community. And what's left behind are mostly mothers with children who are struggling or become homeless. So, I already learned how to lie to these individuals and say I had nothing to do with this, the situation. And it's really sad, as a little kid, that I've already created this hatred and anger and this me versus them mentality with a government entity. It's really kind of crazy. So as I go forward in my childhood, I mean, for sake of time, I'm not going to tell you every traumatic event, but I got a million stories that I could share that are really not that pretty. One I will say that is probably the worst incident was probably at the age of 8, when my mother ended up getting married and she got pregnant again. My stepfather that she had gotten with, violent criminal, never got caught. I would categorize him as a psychopath, even though it's not a clinical designation, but he's someone that I would make comparable to some guy like Ted Bundy. He's killed people. He's dead now, so there's no statute of limitations on this guy, so I can say whatever I want. He's killed people. I've seen stuff he's done as a child. He would beat my mother. This guy was 6'4", probably 300 pounds. I remember him kind of like the Incredible Hulk. He was just very violent, very powerful. He would beat me every night. And one of the biggest things that gets back to me, I think we talk about flashbacks and PTSD, he would always choke me as a little boy. And I have sleep apnea now, which is an interesting manifestation. When I'm in a deep sleep, sometimes I come out shocked and I'm struggling for my breath. I'm reliving that through nightmares. And to this day, 40 years later, nearly, it still doesn't go away. What he did one day is he did this multiple times, but one day it went too far. He would pull a gun on my mother and me, and he would threaten to kill my mother. He would cock a .357 Magnum, put it to my mama's face, and say, "You're gonna do what the fuck I tell you to do, or I'm gonna shoot her." And I wasn't even a bad kid at that time. I think I was a pretty good kid, but he was just in this drug-induced rage often, and he would do this to kind of taunt me and torture me. And then I, as a little boy who's powerless, I would try to fight him and he would beat the shit out of me. But there's one day that he got so upset that he finally decided to point that gun at me and chase me through the family home. And he fired a .357 Magnum 6-round revolver at me 6 times as I ran out of the family home. And I mean, not to scare me, but he was trying to kill me. So I think that's probably the most violent thing I've ever experienced. It's stuck with me my whole life. And it's interesting parallel, because when I'll fast forward a little bit to my crime, guns were always a symbol of power to me and fear simultaneously. Guns and firearms in general, to me, are kind of like this enchanted object. It's kind of I can't explain to you the power that they hold. To take, because I've seen them take people's lives. I almost took someone's life later on in my teenage years with a firearm. And it's just interesting parallel how something that I hated so much as a child, that eventually that fear became transformed into power, and that I needed that in order to survive, or at least I thought that. And that's why I think I went down that pathway to the criminal justice system. So things keep going on in my life. More violence. My mom finally leaves this guy, I think around the age of 14 or 15. And as they're going through their divorce, this is kind of a big shift in my story, where I remember really, truly, that was the day that I became my stepfather. I had started smoking weed and other little things in my community. And he came home one day and he's smoking weed with my little brother, who's 4 or 5 years old. So, and then he's like letting him drink. He's giving him Xanax pills and all kind. And so I'm fighting with him over that. And one day we get into a physical confrontation after the divorce, as he's starting to clear out the stuff out of his trailer, and he just comes at me at full force. Like I've never been in a physical fight like this. I was fighting for my life. He's bashing me in the face, blood's going everywhere, and something in me snaps. So now I'm not this little 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old little boy anymore. I'm a pretty good sized kid, and something snaps in me, and I start attacking him really out of just sheer fear. So I start getting the best of him in a fight, and he pulls out a knife. He stabs me. He's got the knife to my throat. I disarm him somehow. He's a little bit drunk. I think that's probably the only reason, because he was still easily twice my size. I was maybe 160 pounds at that time. But I remember getting him down on a couch, and the couch flipping over, and I had him by the throat, and I'm bashing him in his face. And I remember very vividly, and this is like, a flashback moment from me with trauma. Like, I remember him choking me and my mother as a little boy. And I wanted more than anything to kill this man. And I know in that moment of my life, I wanted more. I just wanted him dead. And I was killing him. He was turning purple. And I think within a second, he stopped breathing. My mother comes into the house. She's screaming, crying, thinking I'm just like attacking him for no reason. And she rips me off of him, and I run out of the house. And I think she did CPR or something on him, and he came back out of it. But like, this never got reported to the police, But then like I left there thinking like, holy, like I became that monster. I went from being this fearful, broken little boy to this violent psychopath. So that's like, what I want you all to kind of understand when you're dealing with a lot of these people, particularly people that have committed acts of violence, is that I don't want forgiveness for what I did, and I'll get to that in a minute. And I don't think a lot of other people do either. They don't want your sympathy, they don't want your empathy. What they do want is your understanding. Is that many of these individuals, myself included, the reason more often than not that led us to this violent, and it doesn't excuse my behavior at all. It does not excuse it, but it explains it. And that I think is a treatment approach, and how we can like really effectively cut the cycle of violence to be more proactive and work with kids and identify these factors, and even work with people that have committed acts of violence when they come home. I think it's a two-pronged system. Like, we can't just deal with people coming home. We got to deal with the front end too. So I think that's an important piece to think about. So all this violence that's going on, I'm getting worse. I'm abusing drugs. And like Dr. Camp mentioned, drug abuse, people that really understand drug abuse, like people are not trying to just get high to have fun. Maybe there are recreational drug users that might like go party once in a while. People are getting high because of the trauma they've dealt with. They're trying to feel normal. And that's one thing I didn't understand as a little boy. Like, I watch people get high all the time. And I'm like, why do you guys do this? This is stupid. And then as I started to like get all this trauma, and get to this point of no, I was suicidal as a teenager. I didn't want to like live my life anymore. I was so tired of all the violence that I experienced and that I did. I started doing drugs, and it made me level out. It didn't make me, of course I got high, but like it made me feel kind of normal, because it shut my parts of my brain off of the recollections of a lot of that violence that, was done to me, and also that I did, or even was probably going to do, thinking about things that I could, become involved in. So I'm strung out on drugs. I'm suicidal. And I'm in and out of the juvenile justice system at the age of 15, 16, 17. At the age of 15, I'm in solitary confinement. That's hell on earth. I don't even want to go on a long tangent about that, but like, that's the worst place in the world any human being can be, particularly children. Like, I still have nightmares about prison to this day, but like the people I've worked with that have been in segregation for carceral spaces they're the most screwed up. And I think out of the 10 years I did later in prison, I did roughly 25% of my time in segregation. And even though that seems like a lot to you on this call, like, I've worked with people that have done 10, 20, 30 years in segregation. And like, they are so damaged. I mean, I don't even know what to do with them sometimes, because like, I can relate to an extent, but like, it's like everything I've experienced on steroids times 10. It's just a really weird situation. So by the time I'm 18, my mom's with this new guy. He's a big time drug dealer, and I'm still this childish mindset, like Dr. Camp mentioned. My prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. I'm very impulsive. I'm aggressive. You know, the real ancient part of my brain that's all about survival and instinct is really driving everything that I do, every decision I make. And I was told, you know, I was not a stupid kid, but like I just turned all that off. All my philosophical and intellectual notions, it was all about fight or flight. And most of it, 99% of the time, it was me fighting. Because if someone put me in a situation where I felt threatened, I would react in the most violent way possible because of, you know, like how I grew up. I'm not going to be a victim anymore. And I saw a lot of these, you know, young men and even women that, you know, grow up in the system. It's like they're watching people get killed in their communities. They're watching all these sexual assaults, or they're being sexually assaulted, the abuse, the drug abuse, everything. They don't want that to reoccur. So they have to do something in order to protect themselves. And unfortunately, they end up hurting other people as a part of that process usually, which is not, I don't think, the intent, but it's kind of like collateral damage. It's how it kind of turns out. None of us, I think, really want to go out and hurt people, but we end up doing it. So I'm 18. I go out of state. I'm actually on probation in the state of Michigan. And back to that firearm as a piece of power. I take a gun with me for protection because I'm used to that. And I'm very fearful of people and situations. I'm very hypervigilant already, aggressive. So prison just compounded that like tenfold too. But I get in a situation where a state trooper pulls me over in Maine. So nobody knows where the hell Maine is unless you've either watched The Shawshank Redemption, you know who Stephen King is, or you've ate Maine lobster. Those are the only ways you know where the hell Maine is, out in New England. Anyway, I get pulled over by a state trooper, and he comes up acting really nervous. This was before, so this was 97. This was before cell phone technology and laptops. And he feels something's wrong. I feel something's wrong. He's up to my over the driver's side of my car. He's making, and that's another thing too with people in prison or that have lived on the streets. We're very good at reading body language. We know when something is about to pop off. It's, I mean, if you don't, you're dead. I mean, to be honest, that's the unfortunate reality. So I'm kind of like this psychiatrist, like really under psychologist, whatever you want to call it, understanding what's about to happen. He puts his hand by his gun, and I, again, no intellectual thought whatsoever, just my response is I go between my legs, I pull my gun out, and I shoot. The cop drops, and as he drops, he fires another round that goes through the top of my car. And within seconds, there's another cop that runs up to the back of my car. He fires 15 rounds right into the back of my car with a 9mm Beretta. Bullets are just zinging through the car. My girlfriend's with me at the time. I don't know how the hell I'm not shot. I don't believe in God, and no offense to anybody that's religious on this call, but like, something saved my life that day. I have no idea. I should be dead. I was shot at 16 times. Fortunately, the officer that fell down, I didn't hit him. They chased me, high-speed chase for, I don't know, 12, 15 miles, put out a spike mat, caught me, and here I'm an 18-year-old kid. I'm off to the penitentiary. And now I'm facing life in prison. Again, this whole act, and again, I don't want sympathy for this, but I want you to understand, all that can be traced back to my childhood. All that can be traced back to every single incident of violence that I seen in my home, that I seen in the community, that was done to me, that was done to my mother or other people in the community when I've seen them get murdered. All those things are kind of swirling around in my mind, in my body, my consciousness. And that stays with you. It never leaves. Like Dr. Kent mentioned, like we can kind of heal trauma to an extent, but it's like if you get your arm cut off, like there's still that ghost feeling there. It's always something still there that never can go away. I mean, you can make it better, but it's never disappears completely. So prison is extremely difficult, and during the Q&A, like I'll answer any questions, but sake of time too, like in the beginning I was extremely violent and aggressive in solitary confinement. And the ironic twist of what helped change me to become nonviolent and actually become the professional I am today was a lot of the juvenile lifers and just lifers in the prison system who committed extreme acts of violence, who basically did some of the same stuff I did. It's just they were a heartbeat faster and 1 inch further over, they took someone's life. So these men, after decades of being in the system, became my mentors. and they empowered me and taught me that it's never okay to commit violence. So a lot of these men had understood after being so long in the system that and it's weird because like they're not trained clinicians. They don't know. They just knew they were messed up. And they just knew that like years later, they realized that, you know, some of the impulsive behavior and the things that happened to them kind of led to the criminal activity. So it was really interesting from a philosophical standpoint to hear all these men that had like killed 2 or 3 people say, you know, Aaron, you're an idiot. Why would you ever shoot at a police officer? And, you know, you need to do something with your life. So these men empowered me, taught me about law, policy, got me into prison education programs. And this, as I started to get home, I got a 19-year sentence. Fortunately, I only had to do 10 years. So I went in 18. I come out at the age of 28. Reentry was extremely difficult. There was no reentry programs for me. I just tried to fake it till I could make it. I was married at that time. It helped kind of dissolve my marriage because I couldn't connect with my wife. I was having all these PTSD flashbacks. I didn't know how to communicate with people. I was still like stuck in that penitentiary mentality. Again, like Dr. Camp mentioned, like there's this spatial and time orientation issues that people have in carceral spaces, and you have that deeply embedded in your consciousness. So coming out, I'm hyper vigilant. You know, I'm not like enclosed in spaces, proximity issues. That's one thing to really think about for clients that you work with that have been incarcerated. Like you really need to understand and respect boundaries. And by boundaries, I don't mean professional boundaries, but like physical proximity. Don't get too close to them. Don't come up behind them. Get them in open spaces. Don't get them in crowded spaces. All these things are very triggering to them. And it's weird because like as I learned this over the years, when I experienced this, I didn't really understand. Now 13 years home, it's kind of more interesting to me to kind of look back and say, I'm not the only one that experiences this. And I can see it when it's happening with other people, particularly those that have come home within the first few months or couple of years. So as I struggle, I get my associates, my bachelor's and master's degree. I do really well in school. So professional, or at least academically, I do really well. I can't get a job though, because I'm a felon. I end up getting a divorce from my wife because I can't like, you know, connect with her in a way. And when we had tensions, like I would disappear and stay away from her. And that hurt her and it kind of blinded our connection. But like not having, you know, the support that I needed, I think was the biggest detriment to me. So like I had all these degrees, whoop-de-doo, but like, and I'm not recidivating. That's another benchmark they talk about all the time with ranchers. Like, he didn't recidivate, so he's successful. That's bullshit. Let me tell you very frankly. Recidivism as a benchmark for success for people that have experienced prison or jail is ridiculous. All it just means is you didn't get caught doing something and you didn't get rearrested or sent back to the criminal justice system. That does not mean that I have a good quality of life. It doesn't mean that I'm not messed up. It doesn't mean that I'm economically supporting my community or my family. It doesn't mean anything, honestly. So we're way off the mark. So that's not a way that we need to look. We need to look at quality of life. Are these people engaging with community? Are they socially acclimated to society? Are they connecting with family members or loved ones or children? Can they hold down a job? Even if they get a job, can they hold down a job? That's another piece too, because they're very traumatized individuals. So to fast forward, my first job was a professor at Western Michigan University when I started a doctoral program. Those were the first people that gave me a chance. And that's when I joke and say I came out of the convict closet and started talking about my prison experiences. And I think that was really to my benefit, to where for the first time I was starting to process some of the stuff that I was going through in a public space, which I think was very healing for me. And then I had lots of mentors that helped me along the way. I dropped out of that program, but stayed there for 3 years. Fast forward, I'm at U of M Dearborn. I'm faculty there now. I'm almost done with my doctorate. And I'm not trying to fluff myself. I did a lot of great things, but here's the thing that's even more important than that. Like, I'm always going to be a convict before I get, you know, when I become a doctor someday, hopefully within the next year, knock on wood, I'm always going to be a convict first. All those degrees and all those accomplishments don't really mean a damn thing in reality. And maybe some of you on this call, I think, probably think differently, but like, let's be real. You know, I'm trying to like sing to the choir here. You guys all want to work with people that are returning citizens, but like most people don't think that way. So it's a constant struggle for them, and understand that a lot of these people are very frustrated because they want to do the right thing, they're really traumatized people. They're struggling, but they have no idea what the hell is going on. Or if I had trauma-informed services, when I come home, I might still be married. I still might have my baby girl. My daughter lives in France now. Like, actually, I'm in France now, which is another weird thing. Like, I'm in Europe now, which I never would have thought would happen in a million years. But that's a trauma too. Like, I get to travel the world, but like my child, who I love dearly, is 2,000 miles away. And that's all my fault, because when I came home, I wasn't able to deal with all the crazy shit that I went through in the prison system. And no one helped me. So, like, what does all that mean? Now, as I work as a reentry provider with the Youth Justice Fund as their director, all the mistakes I made as a younger man, I'm finding ways to develop curriculum, and that's what my doctorate is involved in. I'm building curriculum where I'm bringing people like Dr. Camp, substance abuse counselors, psychologists, clinicians. I'm bringing them together for this perfect marriage to where I let them know what that lived experience is like and what people are really going through from prison. And they help me design, an intensive trauma-informed program in which we're able to help these individuals to, one, cathartically release some of that violence and that trauma and some of the things that they've experienced, two, to bond with other people that have been incarcerated, and three, just to realize that there are people in the community that will embrace them and understand them. Again, they don't want forgiveness. They just want understanding, and that they're not monsters. So we did this summer trauma camp, like Dr. Camp mentioned, where I took 20 people who were all juvenile lifers, meaning that they went into the criminal justice system as babies, basically. I call them babies. They went in 14, 15, 16-year-old kids into the adult criminal justice for some serious conduct, let's be real. Some of them were murders, but they spent 20, 30, 40 years in prison. And as they come home, like I said, so I had all this huge compounded trauma that I never dealt with. So imagine working with people that have spent 40 some years in prison. I think the longest was a man I'm working with now. He's went in at 15. He spent 47 years in prison. He's the nicest old man I've ever met in my life. He's highly intelligent, very interactive with me, but like he's a scared little boy inside, because he still has this arrested development and he's stuck in that like emotional mindset from when he was a child, when he went into the prison system. And then all the compounded trauma that he had as a little boy in his community growing up on the east side of Detroit, watching people get murdered during the crack cocaine era and all this stuff. It's just insane. So like as a society and as, reentry providers, I just want you to kind of like understand, I think the biggest piece that you can take away from this is that, one, humanize these individuals. Regardless of what they did, they served their time, they paid their debt to society in a legal sense. And I even think in an ethical and moral sense too, in all honesty. Like, who are we to judge? And I guarantee there's people on this call that have committed crimes. You just didn't get caught, let's be real. And maybe not as bad as I did, I'll give you that. But at the same token, like, we all make mistakes. And what I've learned and what I try to help with my clients with is that we can evolve beyond our mistakes if we don't repeat those mistakes. And mistakes can be a great learning opportunity to kind of move forward. And I think, again, to think about how, one, working with reentry folks is great, but like, how can we break the front end of this pipeline? So the individuals I work with, like at this summer camp and reentry services that I provide, I'm preparing these individuals over the next year. Is my idea is that then we're going to start next year working with youth who are at risk. So now we're going to break that pipeline, because these kids will listen to people that look like them, sound like them, and come from communities like them. And it's not this scared straight approach, but it's just real talk with these kids and say, you know what? I didn't have a father either. Or I watched someone get murdered in my community, or I seen, or this happened to me. But I'll tell you what, son, you do not want to sit in prison for 20, 30 years. That is no badge of honor that I want to hold. I want to get rid of that. These kids listen to that. So I think that's the future of reentry. So it's that twofold approach. We got to work and stabilize people coming home, give them opportunities. And I applaud all of you that are on this call. I think that's great. But phase two is, how can we get these individuals to a safe space to be productive members of society, be civically engaged, so they can help that next generation. Not that y'all can't help these kids too, because you can and we need you to. but they will listen to people that have that lived experience and grew up like them. So I think that's the future of like reentry program, is let's stop these kids from getting locked up. And that makes all of our communities safer. It stops crime, it slows down, systemic racism and structural inequalities. And like, I go on a 2-hour tangent as a faculty member too about capitalism, which is the root of all evil in the United States and the world. But like, this is just a manifestation. The carceral state is just one problem, of that. So with that, I think I probably will cut it. But Jessica, how do you want to like deal with questions or comments here?
So I think how we can take questions is if people either want to put in the chat box, I have a question, then what we can do is we can unmute you and you can ask us your question. If you don't want to be unmuted, or you're on a computer right now and it doesn't necessarily have the ability to do that because you don't have a microphone, you can also type your question in and we will read it out loud, and we'll be happy to answer it like that. So yeah, let's start with the chat box then.
Okay.
It looks like we already have one in here.
Oh, great.
Malia says, what was your defining moment when you knew you had to develop the Youth Justice Fund or something like it to help others?
A good question. So unfortunately, I wish I could brag about this and say that I founded this nonprofit. I did not. It was started in 2017 by a well-known attorney out of the Ann Arbor area named Deborah LaBelle. And she's won 2 multi-million-dollar lawsuits against the Michigan Department of Corrections for various conditions of confinement against women at Huron Valley and juveniles that were put in very bad situations with sexual abuse and solitary confinement, et cetera. So Deb's idea was to serve these youth. So our mission that Deb created was anybody that was incarcerated at the age of 18 or younger coming home, we need to prioritize their return. And she also helped with a lot of the Miller v. Alabama and Montgomery v. Louisiana juvenile life without parole U.S. Supreme Court decisions. So now juveniles cannot mandatorily get life without parole, and they have to be resentenced if they were given it retroactively. So a lot of these kids, like I talked about, the gentleman that was 15 as a juvenile lifer without parole, he was resentenced and given a term of years, and he was released after 47 years of prison. So her idea was to serve this population with direct services. I took on the role as an executive director after a national search last year, and I've taken it a little bit further beyond just the direct services of providing, employment, housing, transportation, the basic necessities, to understanding, I think what did I really need? I go, yes, of course I needed a house. Yes, I needed a car. Yes, I needed to get into school. But it's really trauma-informed care that if I don't have all these other things, am I really successful? Am I successful because my marriage falls apart, that I can't get a job, that I can't connect with my family because I'm so traumatized with PTSD and other mental health issues? So is that really a benchmark of success? I don't think so. So that was my vision as I came on, and we've just been developing programs ever since. And I will drop, we need donations. We're a small nonprofit. That's how we further our services. You can look us up at www.yjfund.org. But we need volunteers, we need clinicians, and we need community partners. Like some of you that are on this call, we want to partner with you. How can we help you? We can only help individuals that were incarcerated at the age of 18 or younger. But how can we better help you in our communities?
And Erin, just to let you know, I had put in some links with this PowerPoint where people can actually check out your personal website, your TED Talk, the link to the Youth Justice Fund so that they can see some of the work that they're doing, or if they have clients who need your services, and then also the Detroit Free Press article.
That's great. Thank you, Jessica.
Yeah.
And so where we serve too, we started originally in Washtenaw County, but I've expanded that throughout southeastern Michigan. So we work with Monroe, Washtenaw, mostly Wayne now, Oakland, and Macomb. So I'm a returning citizen. I served 17 years and then I lost it.
All right, thank you. It looks like we have another question here. It says, I am also a returning citizen. I served 17 years and have been home for 14 months now. I'm constantly going through different transitions as part of the process of growing into this big world. how have you dealt with compassion and attaching and detaching?
Yeah, good questions. I mean, I don't know if you went into 18 or younger, but even if not, feel free to reach out to me because, like, even if I can't give you services, I'd be happy to connect with you and talk you through things. Say that last part again, Sadie, with compassion and what was it?
Yeah, the question was, how have you dealt with compassion in attaching and detaching?
Hmm. Compassion and attaching and detaching. I'll try to read between those lines there. So I think something unique for me, like I said in my talk, like I really demonized people that were from the prison system as a kid. I hated people that were on parole and that were committing crimes in my community. So I think now my empathy and my compassion for these, because I became that and I made all these mistakes. So now, like, I get to this point to where when I work with people, I think, how can I judge them for their, worst defining moment? That Polaroid shot of, or maybe multiple Polaroid shots like me, where I've been involved in all kinds of activity I'm not going to go into here because I don't want to go do another prison bid. But just saying, like, how can I judge someone else for that? So I think that's where I get a lot of empathy and compassion for these individuals. But it's also very, it's a double-edged sword for me. So I love working with people in prison, and it's, I think, my calling and my passion, but it also hurts the hell out of me. So when I work with clients and they pour their hearts out to me, and tell me all these stories, even when I'm just around a bunch of guys that have been in prison, or women too, like it hurts me because it brings me back to those moments of, violence in the system, of being under carceral control. It's just a really, very difficult situation of bittersweet, to deal with these individuals. But like I push through it, the bad, because I know there's a greater calling there, and I want to help people kind of. I'm not special. I'm just some dumb hillbilly that grew up in a really messed up situation, and I'm very stubborn. I don't like people telling me no. That's really more of my sweet sauce for success, and people believe it in me. So the fact that I can reinvest and help others that are on similar journeys, then I think that's great to empower them and let them kind of fulfill their potential.
Right. Thanks, Aaron.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't look like we have any more questions in the chat, at least. Like we mentioned, if you want to ask your question kind of in person and not in the chat, just let us know in the chat and I can unmute you, and we can do it that way as well.
And anybody that's service providers, if you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to connect. Again, I'll be in Europe for about another week, but when I come back to the States, like, I'm happy to sit down. Our office is in Washtenaw County in the Centennial Plaza off of 124 Pearl Street. That's our main, office. But again, we move a lot through Wayne County, Macomb, Monroe, wherever. But we're always open to partnerships with other agencies because I think it's important. This is like, it takes a village approach. We're not the best nonprofit in town. In fact, like, we have a lot of work to do in fundraising and strategic planning and yada yada. So like, we want to know where other people are hitting the mark, and how can we, again, as a community, come together and serve these individuals.
So we have a participant who I just unmuted, Aaron, and he has a question that he wants to ask you himself.
Sure.
Hey, how you doing, Aaron? My name is Eladio Nino, and I'm a youth mentor for the Detroit Hispanic Development Corporation. So we definitely share similar journeys. Like I said, I had served 17 years. I've been home 14 months successfully. And, being in prison, it's such a cold environment. You know what I'm saying? Like, when I tell people, when you're in prison, you're around concrete, you're around metal, steel, barbed wire, you know what I'm saying? So it suffocates you, and it kind of deprives you of emotion, of compassion, you know what I'm saying? And things like that. So, as I was going through my transition in the process of being home and becoming a progressive person that I grew into being, I think a lot of people looked at me as if I became incompassionate to other people's needs and their wants and their struggles. And, nothing has ever come easy for me in my life. Everything that I have, I did it with God, with prayer, and with diligence. You know what I'm saying? So,
you know, a lot of time, even coming home, I'm surrounded with a lot of grief, a lot of poverty, addiction, just a lot of, you know, everything you every time you look at the news, you read an article, you know, even me, I'm from Southwest Detroit. You know, I live in an area where you see, you know, you see good, you see bad, and you see ugly. You know what I mean? And so I just really wanted to know, where were you at in the process that you went through as far as having compassion for others, and when I asked about detaching and attaching and detaching, is because you know, one of the first things I was taught when I went to prison is forget about everything outside of prison, because everything outside of prison is out of your control, and the more you try to control it, the harder time you're going to have adapting to the prison life. So once I learned to master that and just live where I was and forget about everything outside of that, I got consumed by prison life and everything that comes with it. So one of the things that I had to learn how to do is attach and detach to people, because as you know, in a population, somebody can get in trouble, go to segregation, somebody get transferred out. You know, I've been walking the yard for a year with this guy. You know, you build your own family, you build your brotherhoods inside of prison, and then, but you're always detaching and attaching because you never know what's going to happen. People come and go in and out of your life, not only people from society, family, and friends, but also people who you build bonds with in prison. So it's like, it's almost as if you have your list of people who are replaceable and irreplaceable, and it seems like I feel more like people are are more replaceable than irreplaceable now.
Yeah, well, first, I mean, welcome home, man. That's, I totally get what you're saying now that given the context. So like, I think, and I think that's a bad thing we were taught in prison, to be completely honest with you, bro. Like the fact that we were taught to detach so much, I think was really a bad thing, even though like in the moment it might have helped us kind of like live our daily lives to like not think about family or friends or the outside. I think that was to our detriment. I think it's really important for us as community members now, and particularly both of us that have been to prison, like to reach back into the system when we can and really keep those lines of connection open. Because if people are not community engaged while they're inside, they lose that bond and that thing. Like you're talking about, like, you know, there's guys that I know that are going to be on the yard for the rest of their lives. And I have deep bonds with them. These are men that I respect, that I love, that, you know, looked out for me and taught me things that, and not, you know, like criminal activity sometimes too, but like things that like have really changed my life and who I am. So I think like when coming home too, I get what you're saying. Like it's really hard, and that's a problem I had with my ex-wife, is that I was very cold and robotic and institutionalized. And all I can say is that it's gonna come with time that you're gonna shed that skin. Does that make sense? Like, and you're really fresh home, not even a couple years home now. Like it's gonna take time, and I hate to tell you this, but like my theory is this: like for every year you spend in prison, man, you're gonna need that many years out on the streets to kind of just feel like a normal state of acceptance, of understanding, of a normal like emotional attachment or detachment. It's really going to just take time. And I've been home 13 years now, and I'll be honest, like I just now feel like I'm getting this started, and I only did 10 years. So I think with time and patience it will come to you, but like feel free to reach out to me. That's another thing that I've been working on with my clients, is that we create these bonding experiences out here with people like ourselves that have been justice impacted. But like, how can we create that bond and go through these emotional things, and as men like get emotional, because as you know, we can't do that. We can't let, you know, we can't cry, we can't think about our mama that just died, or a child, or anything like that. We can't express emotion. It's going to take you to be around other people like us to feel comfortable, and then slowly I think integrate with other community members to be able to express emotion. It's something that's going to, it's really a learned behavior. I mean, your brain is programmed to like, you know, hide all that physical emotion and everything. So I think it's just with time you'll get it. And again, like I'm happy to help facilitate that with you. I've been it's been a couple of years since I've been to the Detroit Hispanic Corporation, but I love to come back out there and peep it out and see what you guys are doing. I love the artwork and murals you guys had there years ago, and I know you guys have done a lot of stuff with youth from Southwest Detroit, you know, and that's important for the Latino and Hispanic community too, because I think they're very less often talked about, you know, as individuals coming from marginalized communities too. I think we often talk about all the violence that's happening with African American communities, which is totally, Like, we got to do something about that. But we often forget about Hispanic, Latino, Indigenous, Arab American, and other populations that are struggling as well. So I think we got to come together as a collective and really fight these systems of oppression, regardless of race, religion, creed, etc. But I'm glad you're home, man. And yeah, please reach out to me, and I'll be back in a couple weeks, and let's connect and sit down. I think you're muted. We can't hear you right now. Sadie, can you unmute it, or he?
No, man, definitely. Thank you very much, and I would definitely look forward to working with you in the future, because I also do what I can through my agency to provide resources for returning citizens, and just explaining the process, because I've been going through the process myself. So yes, I definitely like to touch base with you and stay in touch and see what we can come up with.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I would love to talk to whoever's running, the Detroit Hispanic Corporation now, and see if, because we work with people in Wayne County too, and you might even have some clients that are eligible for our services. I'm all about double dipping services. If you've got some people that we can work with and vice versa, I think that's a way to better support people that are coming home.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it, man.
All right. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too.
Aaron,
I like this picture you got put up here, Jessica.
Yeah,
That's kind of trippy
thank
cool.
you. Thank you so much for sharing your story and your personal journey of recovery. I'm so glad you were able to join us today. And as I thought, I think that really helped solidify some of the things that I was talking about regarding trauma exposure and how it can lead to incarceration, and how we have to think about the traumatic process, almost thinking about how we're going to be undoing it. So in conclusion, reentry done from a stance of healing-centered restorative engagement is about restoration of personal identity and relationships. It calls for those who have done harm to others to acknowledge the impact of their actions and to, as much as possible, repair the harm that was done. It decouples an individual from their behavior. We can do bad and not be bad. There's a path back to belonging, acceptance, healing, love, and recovery. On the systems level, it's about creating change to a system that has never worked to deter crime because it has failed fundamentally to understand the roots of what causes crime. It amplifies rather than challenges the social illnesses of our time, from systemic racism to community violence to trauma. Even this global pandemic has been exacerbated in a system of punishment that, if changed to a system of well-being and accountability, could profoundly alter the direction of the wicked problems that we face. Thank you so much for your time today and for joining us, and I look forward to our continued work together this fall. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate it. And you'll be getting some follow-up emails from both Lori Kopak and Dr. Camp. We'd really love to hear your feedback on this training and this process. So I put a link to the feedback survey you'll obviously be receiving by email. And we'll also have that survey going out about the small group sessions and understanding, what people want to cover there. So thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you so much, Jordan.
Mm-hmm.